The rope burns your wrists as they drag you down the stone corridor. Your habit, the very cloth that named you before God, hangs torn at the shoulder. You try to pray, but the words dissolve under the weight of boots on marble, the smell of smoke curling through doorways that should have remained sacred. Behind you, someone is sobbing. Ahead, the altar you once knelt before every dawn now lies overturned, its silver chalice rolling slowly across the floor like a coin spent in some terrible transaction. The year is 1527. The city is Rome, and what is about to happen in these cloistered walls will be recorded in whispers, in legal petitions filed years too late, and in the margins of convent ledgers that stop mid-sentence never to be finished. Before we go any deeper, I genuinely want to know, where are you listening from right now? It amazes me every single time that a story this dark, buried this deep in history, still finds its way to people across the entire world. Leave a comment. I read them all. The sack of Rome wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. Not to this city. Rome was the beating heart of Christendom, home to the Pope himself, draped in centuries of accumulated wealth and ritual power. But in early May of that year, an army arrived at its gates, sin-paid, unfed, and uncontrolled. Spanish tercios, German Landsknechts, Italian mercenaries, soldiers who had been promised wages that never came, led by commanders who were dead or absent. What followed wasn't just a siege, it was a collapse. A city that thought itself untouchable learned in a single week what happens when discipline evaporates and men decide that plunder is their only pension. And among the most vulnerable targets in that collapsing world were the convents. Not because they were military threats, because they were soft, enclosed, and rich. Convents in Renaissance Rome were more than houses of prayer. They were repositories of wealth gold-threaded vestments, illuminated manuscripts, liturgical silver, heavy enough to fund a campaign. They were also social institutions. Noble families placed daughters there with dowries. Widows sought refuge within their walls. The nuns kept archives, recorded births and deaths, managed rents. They were, in a sense, small municipal governments wrapped in the language of devotion. And when the soldiers came, they didn't just see women. They saw treasure chests guarded by silence and vows. Contemporary letters, written by bishops, ambassadors, surviving sisters paint the same picture from different angles. One envoy writes simply, "Outrages unspeakable." Another, more blunt, catalogues the convents destroyed. The women taken, the altars stripped. A nun's own letter, smuggled out weeks later, describes the sound of axes on the sacristy door, the smell of burning wood, and a sister who died standing in the doorway trying to bar the entrance with her body. These aren't dramatic inventions. They're administrative records, petitions for compensation, depositions given under oath, the kind of documents people write when they need the world to believe them. But here's where the story turns strange. The violence wasn't random. It was patterned, methodical even. Soldiers didn't just storm convents on impulse. They went there deliberately. Why? Because the breakdown of order created a perverse logic. Convents were known to hold wealth. They were isolated, often located on the city's edges, or tucked into quiet neighborhoods. Their occupants were women bound by vows of enclosure, untrained, unable to flee, and perhaps most crucially, desecrating a convent carried symbolic weight. It was an attack on the city's moral infrastructure, a way of saying, nothing is sacred anymore. When the first units broke through the convent gates, they moved through the buildings like inventory clerks. Chests were smashed open. Silver plate was bundled into sacks. Vestments were torn from their hooks, and the women some were dragged into courtyards. Others were hunted through dormitories and chapels. A handful tried to hide. One record mentions a novice who concealed herself in a wardrobe, staying silent for hours until she died of exposure, rather than reveal her location. Another tells of a young sister who blocked a doorway with a wooden chair, refusing to move even as the door splintered around her. These aren't heroic legends inflated by time. They're entries in convent annals, cross-referenced with family letters, supported by burial registers that list sudden clusters of deaths in early May 1527. The details align. The grief is consistent. And the men who did this, many were professionals. Veterans of campaigns across Italy, soldiers who had fought under imperial banners, who knew the difference between a military objective and a civilian target. Letters they sent home reveal something unsettling. Some boasted of their plunder. Others expressed shame, writing cryptically about the irreligious conduct of comrades or deeds that dishonor the faith. But shame didn't stop the violence, and boasting didn't bring punishment, because the command structure that might have restrained them was gone. The general who could have imposed discipline was dead. The paymasters who might have bought obedience were absent. What remained was a vacuum and men with weapons filling it. Here's a question that haunts the historical record. Where was the Pope? He was there, barricaded in the Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress overlooking the Tiber, surrounded by a small guard while his city burned. Diplomatic dispatches describe him negotiating terms of surrender from behind stone walls, while convents a mile away were being emptied. It's not that he didn't care, it's that he was powerless. The political machinery that should have protected Rome had failed at every level. Gates were undermanned. Militias either fled or joined the looters. And the international powers who might have intervened, Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, were too busy calculating advantage to send relief. So the nuns were left to face what came alone. Legal records filed in the months and years after the sack reveal the scale of what was lost. Convents submitted petitions to the papal court listing stolen goods, destroyed buildings, and more obliquely, damages to communal life. That phrase hides a world of pain. It means novices who never arrived because families no longer trusted the convent's safety. It means dowries that were never recovered, leaving women without the financial foundation that made religious life possible. It means psychological collapse recorded in marginal notes. No new entrants this year. The sisters do not sing. We cannot open the chapel. Some petitions were granted. Most were delayed for years. A few were never answered at all. The bureaucracy of grief moved slowly, and many of the women who filed those claims died before seeing restitution. But the physical evidence survived. Archaeologists working in Roman churches centuries later found layers of destruction-scorched beams, smashed masonry, tombstones displaced from their crypts. In one convent crypt, bones were discovered, piled haphazardly, instead of laid in careful burial. Charred fragments of wooden chests sat among collapsed tiles. These findings aren't dramatic, they're forensic, and they corroborate what the written sources say. That many convents were directly assaulted, that fires were set, and that women died either in the chaos or by deliberate violence. There's a particular kind of cruelty in how memory works. Some convents rebuilt, others never reopened. Streets that once led to flourishing communities of prayer now wind past palaces built with stones looted from ruined chapels. The city absorbed the trauma, paved over it, moved on. But the silence in the archives, the convents, that simply vanish from city records after 1527, is itself a kind of testimony, a ledger that stops mid-entry, a register that lists a sister's name on May 5th and then nothing. Not every soldier participated in the worst acts. That matters. Depositions occasionally record moments of rescue men who hid sisters in attics, families who opened doors to fleeing nuns, clergy who risked punishment to offer sanctuary. These acts complicate any simple story of villains and victims. They show that even in collapse, choices were made. Agency persisted. Not everyone looked away, but those small acts of mercy couldn't undo the larger structure of failure. The same military and political systems that allowed the sack to happen later struggled to hold anyone accountable. Courts-martial were held. Some soldiers were punished, but many escaped severe censure because the armies needed them for future campaigns. The cycle continued, and the nuns, those who survived, carried something that couldn't be written into a ledger. Prayer books from the period, annotated in the margins, show a shift in piety. Prayers of supplication replaced by pleas for protection. Confessors' notes mention nightmares, persistent fear, and inability to return to the rhythms of communal worship. Spiritual directors wrestled with sins their manuals hadn't prepared them for, not sins committed, but sins endured. The theological debates that followed are preserved in treatises and sermons. Preachers asked, how could Christian soldiers commit such acts? Was this divine punishment for the city's wealth and pride? Or was it a failure of human will, a moral breakdown that required extraordinary penance? The answers varied, but the questions themselves reveal something important. Contemporaries understood that what had happened wasn't just a military event, it was a rupture in the moral order, and no amount of ritual cleansing could fully repair it. Over time, the event entered cultural memory in strange ways. Painters created altarpieces showing martyred nuns ascending to heaven, images that reframed suffering as sanctity, but also preserved the memory of violence. Plays revisited the sack as a cautionary tale. Chronicles returned obsessively to the scene, unable to look away. These aren't just artistic responses. They're evidence of a society that remembered because it couldn't forget. Even the objects tell stories. Chalices dulled by fire, manuscript fragments with scorch marks along the edges, silverware that turned up in foreign treasuries, sold through networks of plunder that stretched across Europe. Museums today hold these items, often with provenance gaps that trace back to those chaotic weeks. Restitution debates in later centuries often begin here, with objects that carry the weight of theft and loss in their very existence. The historical lesson isn't complicated. When payment fails, when discipline collapses, when institutions prioritize military expediency over civilian protection, the most vulnerable become casualties. The nuns of Rome in 1527 weren't abstractions. They were daughters, sisters, women who had dedicated their lives to prayer and found themselves at the intersection of power's failure and violence's logic. What remains now is fragments. A letter that begins with steady handwriting and ends in a scrawl. A ledger with a name and then a marginal note taken crypt where bones lie in the wrong order. These are the ruins beneath the city's later grandeur. They don't demand vengeance. They don't even demand justice, not anymore, but they demand to be remembered, not as symbols, as lives. The rope that burned those wrists, the boots on the marble, the sister who died in the doorway, these aren't metaphors. They're facts, preserved in ink and stone, waiting for anyone willing to look. And the question they leave behind isn't about the past. It's about what happens when the systems meant to protect the powerless decide that protection is too costly, too inconvenient, or simply too late, the altar still lies overturned in the archive's memory. The chalice still rolls, and somewhere in the margin of a 500-year-old ledger, a name waits unfinished, asking to be spoken aloud one more time.